The Masked Rider Mystery. Chapter 1, The Telegraph from Dodge City. The winter of 1874 had been hard on Chicago. The wind swept icy from the lake, rattling the windowpanes of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, carrying with them the mournful sound of a city caught between industrial progress and 1,000 hidden crimes. Allan Pinkerton, gray-bearded now but with eyes still as sharp as the day he'd foiled his first counterfeiters, sat at his oak desk beneath the gaslight. The world knew him as the father of private detection, a man who had chased train robbers, broken up assassination plots, and pursued fraudsters across state lines. Yet every case still began the same way, a note, a knock, or, in this instance, the shrill clatter of a telegraph key. The boy from the office downstairs burst into the room, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Wire for you, Mr. Pinkerton." "From Dodge City." Pinkerton accepted the folded slip, running a thick thumb over the paper before his eyes took in the coded message. It was brief, but urgent. Stagecoach robberies growing violent. Gold shipments lost. Driver dead. Survivors speak of masked rider. Request Pinkerton Agency immediate assistance. Tate, Marshal of Dodge. He read it twice, then a third time, noting the deliberate phrasing. Drivers dead. Gold vanished. Witnesses muttering about some phantom rider. Such things were often born of fear and whiskey, yet behind every superstition he had learned to search for the hand of man. Pinkerton leaned back, stroking his beard. Dodge City, frontier town, cattle hub, notorious for saloons and lawless men spilling out of Texas. A place where the frontier still fought civilization, and where men cloaked crimes in tales of ghosts to frighten the gullible. He set the telegram down and reached for his black notebook, the one bound in leather and scarred from years of rain, dust, and gunpowder. In neat, deliberate script he wrote. Case, Dodge City robberies. Masked rider reported. Marshal Tate requesting agency assistance. Objective, investigate, dispel superstition, identify culprits, recover gold. The flame in the gas lamp flickered as if punctuating his resolve. He summoned his chief operative, George Bangs, and informed him of his departure. The frontier breeds strange legends, George. But I wager this masked rider bleeds like any other man. Prepare travel arrangements. I ride west at dawn. 2 days later, Pinkerton's boots crunched the platform of the Union Pacific Station. The westbound train loomed, its iron bulk shrouded in coal smoke. Passengers hurried aboard, farmers with families, prospectors with dusty faces, gamblers clutching cards in nervous fingers. Pinkerton carried only a battered carpetbag, his revolver holstered beneath his coat, and the resolve of a man accustomed to facing killers without ceremony. The journey stretched across frozen Illinois fields into the rolling plains of Missouri, and then onward toward the wild expanse of Kansas. Each night he recorded his observations in his notebook. The newspapers were full of rumors, stage lines shuttered, cattlemen refusing to travel, whispers of a ghostly outlaw haunting the trails. In the smoking car, Pinkerton listened to ranchers argue. They say he wears a silver mask, polished bright so it blinds a man under moonlight, one insisted. Nonsense, said another. No spirit rides off with government bullion. Flesh and blood, sure as my name. Pinkerton neither confirmed nor denied, but the corner of his mouth tightened. He had built his life on the principle that there were no ghosts in the world, only men who found profit in fear. Still, he made careful note of every description, mask, silver sheen, sudden vanishing into gullies. If the town was gripped by legend, then legend itself had become a weapon. On the fourth morning, the train hissed to a stop at Dodge City. Dust swirled across the platform despite the chill, and the smell of horses, smoke, and cheap whiskey hung heavy. The town sprawled raw and brash, its streets lined with wooden storefronts, dance halls, and saloons where piano music bled into drunken shouts. Dodge was the kind of town where a man's life could be bought for a gold coin and forgotten by morning. Marshal Tate awaited him, a broad man with a thick mustache and a limp in his gait. His handshake was firm but his eyes restless. "Mr. Pinkerton, by God, I didn't believe the telegraph would bring you so quick." "Death and gold vanishings have a way of hastening my step," Pinkerton replied dryly. "Tell me everything." They walked together down the muddy main street toward the marshal's office. Tate described the robberies, 3 stagecoaches in as many weeks, each struck with military precision. The riders emerged from the darkness, firing before the drivers could react. Witnesses swore one figure glowed under moonlight, face hidden behind a polished mask. Then the gang would vanish into the hills, leaving no tracks anyone could follow. "They call him the Masked Rider," Tate said grimly. "The people are half believing it's some spirit of vengeance. My deputies are jumpy, the stage line's threatening to shut down, and if we lose the gold shipments, this town dies." Inside the office, Pinkerton examined the latest evidence, a bloody driver's coat, empty strongboxes, and a crude sketch made by a shaken passenger. The sketch showed a rider with hollow, gleaming eyes, cloak flaring in the wind. Pinkerton studied it without emotion. "Fear makes artists of us all," he murmured. "But a mask, now, that is something tangible. Tell me, Marshal, who profits from this?" Tate frowned. "That's just it. Could be bandits, could be rival cattle outfits, could even be deserters from the army. But they leave not a trace." Pinkerton closed his notebook and rose. "Every crime leaves a trace, Marshal. Men vanish only when no one looks in the right place. That will be our task." That evening, he took a solitary walk through Dodge. The saloons spilled laughter and curses into the street. A piano clattered inside the Long Branch, cowboys stamped boots in drunken rhythm, and painted women leaned in doorways with practiced smiles. Pinkerton passed unnoticed, a shadow in his long coat, listening. Whispers of the Masked Rider followed him like smoke. Fear was thick in the air, feeding on itself, and he understood at once the magnitude of the case. This was no mere string of robberies. This was legend taking root, threatening commerce, order, and law. Back in his rented room at the Dodge House Hotel, he sat by the lamp and opened his notebook once more. His entry was spare, deliberate, as always. The frontier breeds phantoms, but phantoms do not shoot drivers nor carry off gold. Riders vanish into gullies, witness speaks of lantern light signals. Suspect organization with discipline. Objective, expose men behind mask, restore order. As the lamp guttered and the long whistle of a distant train drifted through the night, Allan Pinkerton laid down his pen. Tomorrow would bring him to the first stagecoach wreck, where blood stained the Kansas dirt. Tomorrow he would begin stripping illusion from truth, until the Masked Rider stood revealed not as a spirit, but as a man who had underestimated the reach of Allan Pinkerton. Chapter 2, The Empty Stagecoach. The morning broke cold over the Kansas plains, pale light filtering through a thin veil of cloud. Pinkerton rode out beside Marshal Tate, the hooves of their mounts drumming against the frozen earth as prairie grass whispered in the wind. Dodge City still slept behind them, its raucous saloons silenced in the dawn chill, but the countryside bore scars of violence that no silence could mask. Ahead, a deputy waited on the ridge, pointing toward the gully where the last robbery had taken place. When they descended, the wreck of the stagecoach lay splayed in the hollow like a gutted beast. The vehicle's wooden sides were splintered by bullet holes, iron bands twisted, leather harness cut clean. The driver's bench was empty save for dried blood darkening the planks. Crows had gathered, black shapes against the pale sky, flapping lazily as the men approached. Pinkerton dismounted with deliberate calm. He pulled his notebook from his coat pocket, flipped it open, and began the ritual that had carried him through countless scenes of death: observe, record, deduce. He crouched near the coach wheel, running his hand over the cracked wood. The ground nearby bore wagon ruts, but something was amiss. They ended abruptly in a swirl of dragged sagebrush, as if someone had swept the earth clean. He straightened, calling Tate over. "Notice here. Your robbers aren't ghosts. They dragged brush behind the horses to erase their tracks." Tate squinted, muttering, "I'll be damned. My deputies swore they vanished." "Men vanish only when we permit our eyes to be fooled," Pinkerton replied, noting the breadth of the drag marks. "They're clever. Military clever." He moved to the rear of the coach, where the strongbox had been split open with brutal efficiency. The lock lay in two pieces on the ground. Pinkerton held the jagged edges to the light. "Not pride," he murmured, "but struck with a hammer head. Quick work, practiced." From the shadows of the gully emerged an old rancher with a weathered face, hat in his hands. He had been among the passengers spared by the outlaws. His voice trembled as he recounted the attack. "We just crossed the ridge when they came ridin' out of the dark. 4 of them. One wore that terrible mask, shireen white, eyes hollow as graves." He raised his hand, and the others fired without hesitation. Driver never had a chance. Pinkerton studied him carefully. "Did the masked man speak?" The rancher hesitated. "Not a word. Just gave signs, like soldiers do." The detective's pencil scratched quickly across paper, "Silent leader. Gestures in command. Mask polished bright. Psychological warfare." Pinkerton asked again, softer this time, "And after? How did they vanish?" The man rubbed his hands together. "They thundered off toward the gully. We followed a ways, but tracks just disappeared. Like the ground swallowed them." Pinkerton closed his notebook with a snap. "The ground swallows no man. They know this land better than you do." While deputies scoured the edges of the ravine, Pinkerton wandered alone, eyes fixed on subtle signs others overlooked. A faint indentation in the earth, almost lost beneath dragged brush. The imprint of a boot heel with distinctive ridges. A thin thread of cloth snagged on mesquite. He crouched, holding the fragment up, coarse cavalry wool, dyed dark blue. His mind ticked forward. Could these robbers be deserters, turning their training to outlaw gain? Marshal Tate watched uneasily as Pinkerton pocketed the cloth. "You thinkin' army men?" "I think of facts, Marshal. This fabric was not spun by frontier homesteads." He mounted his horse once more. "Take me to the survivor who claims to have seen their faces." By afternoon, they reached a small ranch house where a woman lay recovering from shock. She had been inside the coach during the attack, spared when the robbers took only the gold and left passengers unharmed. Her name was Abigail Mercer, schoolteacher, eyes steady despite the bruise darkening her cheek. "They were no phantoms," she said firmly when Pinkerton sat beside her. "They were men. 3 wore kerchiefs. The one with the mask, he carried himself different. Straight-backed. Like an officer." "An officer?" Pinkerton leaned forward. "Yes. He gave signals, not words." I know the look of command. My father drilled men during the war. This masked rider has seen discipline. Pinkerton's pencil scrawled again. He asked about the mask. It glimmered under moonlight, almost blinding. But when he turned, I caught the edge of it. It was metal. I'd swear on scripture it was part of a breastplate, hammered into shape. The detail struck him with clarity. Fear weaponized through illusion. Moonlight as ally. He thanked the woman gravely, assuring her justice would not sleep. At sundown, Pinkerton returned alone to the wreckage. The prairie stretched silent, endless waves of grass turning gold beneath a dying sun. He walked slowly around the broken stagecoach, touching the bullet-scarred wood, closing his eyes to reconstruct events. He saw the ambush unfold in his mind, lantern signals from the ridge, riders charging in formation, the masked leader directing without words, brush dragged to erase their exit. It was no ghost, no legend, merely a soldier turned predator. He opened his notebook once more, his handwriting precise despite the fading light. Stagecoach ambush executed with discipline. Evidence: brush drag, cavalry cloth, hammer strike on lock, officer's bearing. Mask constructed of metal, breastplate fragment. Objective: identify deserters or dismissed soldiers operating from frontier refuge. Next step: question locals on lantern lights rumored before raids. The prairie wind carried the distant howl of a coyote. Pinkerton closed the book and stood, his silhouette stark against the horizon. Tomorrow would bring the saloons of Dodge City, and with them, the whispers of men who drank too much and remembered more than they ought. But tonight, the image of the empty coach lingered before him, a mute witness to violence and fear. He touched the worn butt of his revolver, not in threat but in reminder. The West had its own rules, but even on the frontier, truth left its fingerprints. His task was to find them before the masked rider struck again. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Saloon. Night descended over Dodge City like a velvet curtain stitched with gun smoke and lamp glow. The air buzzed with fiddles, laughter, and the metallic clink of poker chips, but beneath it all lay a current of unease. Pinkerton, never one to announce himself loudly, moved through the main street with his coat collar turned against the cold wind. His destination was the Golden Spur Saloon, the liveliest den in town and the place where tongues wagged once whiskey loosened them. Inside, the room was a furnace of bodies and noise. The bar stretched long and polished from years of elbows leaning in, the walls hung with hunting trophies and oil lamps that spilled an amber haze. A piano clattered furiously in the corner, its melody battling against cowboy shouts. Painted women in bright dresses leaned close to cattlemen, their laughter sharp and practiced. Pinkerton slid into the saloon with a presence so unassuming most men barely marked him. He had built a career on such invisibility. He ordered no drink. Instead, he leaned against a post near the back, hat brim shading his eyes, listening. Words were the cheapest commodity in Dodge, carelessly traded, overheard by those who cared to listen. Masked rider struck again, muttered a rancher, voice hushed but urgent. Gold gone clean off the trail. Driver killed outright. Bah, scoffed a gambler, shuffling cards with restless hands. A ghost ain't carryin' off bullion. Man's just flesh, clever flesh, maybe, but flesh. The rancher shook his head. You didn't see him. Lantern lights flickered from the ridge first, then they came like shadows. He raised his hand, just his hand, and the others fired like soldiers. At another table, two drifters whispered about coded signals. I swear, I seen it. A lantern blinkin' 3 times from the bluffs before that stage went down. They're speakin' in flashes, like the army used in the war. Pinkerton's ears sharpened. Lantern codes. That was no superstition, it was method. He slipped a small notebook from his pocket and, under cover of his coat, wrote, "Reports of lantern signals preceding raids. Suggests organized communication, military routes." When he looked up, a young barmaid stood watching him curiously. Her name, he would learn, was Clara Dawson. Her eyes were wary, though not unfriendly. "You're new here," she said softly, balancing a tray against her hip. "Passing through," Pinkerton replied in his measured Scottish burr. "Though I hear the masked rider passes through more often than most." Her gaze flicked about to be sure no one listened. "Best keep that talk low. Folks round here spook easy. Some say he's a spirit. I say he's a man with soldiers ridin' behind him. My ranch lies north of town. Twice now I've seen riders skirtin' my land after midnight. One limps somethin' fierce." Pinkerton's eyes sharpened. "A limp, you say?" She nodded. "Left leg, I think. Doesn't sit right in the saddle." He made a quick notation in his book, "Witness reports limping rider. Could match wound sustained during ambush skirmish." Clara leaned closer. "Be careful o' skin. Men round here don't like strangers pokin' into shadows. The riders got half the town too scared to talk, and the other half prayin' it's all just a story." Pinkerton tipped his hat in thanks. Stories are powerful weapons. But weapons can be turned back upon the hand that wields them. As the night wore on, he moved quietly from one end of the saloon to the other, listening. A cattleman muttered about seeing horses vanish into the canyons where no sane man would ride. A gambler bragged that he once dealt cards to a soldier dismissed dishonorably from the cavalry, a man who claimed he'd find fortune in gold outside the law. Each scrap was added to the puzzle forming in Pinkerton's mind. He did not chase after rumors blindly, he sifted them, weighed their merit, and sought the patterns beneath. The lantern codes, the limp, the military precision, these were no ghost's habits. These were the traces of deserters, perhaps even men who had once worn the U.S. uniform. He closed his notebook and stepped outside into the cold night air. The saloon's music and laughter dulled behind him, replaced by the lonely creak of a hanging sign and the crunch of boots in the frost. The sky stretched vast and black above the frontier, stars burning like lanterns of their own. On the far ridge, he thought he saw a flicker of light. Just once, then gone. His jaw tightened. Coincidence, or signal? He lingered, but the darkness swallowed any further sign. Later, in his room at the Dodge House Hotel, Pinkerton sat at the writing desk, lamp flickering over his notes. He assembled the fragments. Riders move with military precision. Silent leader gives signals, gestures, not words. Lantern flashes reported from ridge before raids. One outlaw with limp. Possible old wound. Metal mask, likely fashioned from cavalry breastplate. He set down his pen and leaned back, the chair groaning beneath his weight. The frontier was fertile ground for myth-making. Men feared what they could not explain, and fear made them pliable. A mask polished to gleam beneath moonlight could become the face of a phantom in the eyes of terrified witnesses. But Pinkerton knew better. Every ghost had a heartbeat somewhere behind the disguise. A knock interrupted his thoughts. He opened the door to find Marshal Tate, hat pulled low. "Word is you've been stirring up questions," Tate said. "Folk talk easy after whiskey, but I don't want the whole town panicked." Pinkerton met his gaze evenly. "Better questions than silence, Marshal. Silence feeds superstition, and superstition feeds panic. My work is to strip it away until only men remain. Tate shifted uncomfortably, his limp more pronounced after the long day. Just don't push too hard. Out here, shadows bite back. Pinkerton closed the door after him, thoughtful. The limp. Clara's testimony echoed in his mind. He wrote one more line in his notebook before extinguishing the lamp: observe Marshall Tate more closely. That night, as the wind prowled the alleys of Dodge, Allan Pinkerton lay awake on his narrow bed, staring at the dark ceiling. Somewhere beyond the town, in canyons and ghost-haunted gullies, a masked rider plotted his next ambush. The detective's mind was already 2 steps ahead, laying snares of logic and reason for a foe who relied on fear and shadows. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would ride north to Clara Dawson's ranch. The riders she'd glimpsed might have left behind more than tracks. Perhaps, with luck, they had left their first mistake. Chapter 4: The Widow's Testimony. The Kansas morning stretched wide and silver as Pinkerton guided his horse northward, leaving Dodge behind. A thin mist clung to the low gullies, and the prairie rolled outward in endless swells of frostbitten grass. Somewhere in that sea of silence, the masked rider and his men had passed. The trail to Clara Dawson's ranch was rough, worn by cattle hooves and wagon wheels, but Pinkerton's mind paid little attention to the jolting ride. He replayed every whisper he had collected, the lantern signals, the limp, the soldier's bearing. Each fragment hovered incomplete, awaiting the one piece that would fit the lock. Clara Dawson's homestead appeared as a weather-beaten house fenced by split rails, with a red barn crouched against the wind. Smoke rose faint from the chimney, carrying the scent of burning cottonwood. She stood on the porch when Pinkerton approached, her shawl pulled tight, a rifle resting in the crook of her arm. The wariness of the frontier woman was etched into her posture, but her eyes recognized him from the saloon. "You came," she said simply, lowering the gun. Pinkerton dismounted, tipping his hat. "A promise is a form of contract, Mrs. Dawson. And I always honor a contract. May we speak where prying ears cannot?" She nodded and led him inside. The home was modest, bare plank floors, a table scarred from years of use, shelves lined with jars of preserves. A single portrait hung above the mantel, a younger Clara beside her late husband, his face stern yet kind. "Sit," she offered, setting the rifle aside. "I'll tell you what I know, though it ain't much." Pinkerton took out his notebook, pencil poised. "Begin from the first time you saw them." Her story unfolded steadily. "It was near midnight 2 weeks back. I woke to the sound of hooves. Thought maybe strays from a neighbor's herd, but when I looked from the window, I saw 4 riders cutting across the north pasture. They moved with purpose, not wanderin'. One leaned heavy in the saddle, like his leg wouldn't carry him." Pinkerton scribbled quickly, rider with limp confirmed. "Likely same as survivor testimony. They didn't see me, I reckon. The moon was strong that night. One carried a lantern, shaded, flashing it 3 times toward the ridge. Moments later, another light answered from far off. After that, they pushed hard west." Pinkerton's eyes sharpened. "Lantern code again. Did you recognize any of them? A voice, perhaps?" Clara shook her head. "They rode silent. Faces covered. But the way they sat their horses, too straight, too drilled. That ain't the ride of farmers or drunks. That's soldier C-tin. The detective allowed himself the faintest nod. The picture was tightening, deserters, perhaps an officer among them, using discipline and deception to carve fear into the plains. Clara hesitated, then added, 2 days later, I found something odd in my barn. A stack of oats I hadn't bought, fresh sacks with government stampin'. Somebody stowed 'em there in the night. I reckon they meant to fetch 'em later, but I moved the lot behind the house. Figured I'd rather not be known as their quartermaster. Pinkerton requested to see the sacks. She led him to a lean-to where the burlap bags rested beneath tarpaulin. He knelt, examining the stenciled lettering, U.S. Army Commissary. The rope ties were neat, military knots, not the rough lashings of cowhands. This is no accident, he murmured. They are feeding their horses with stolen stores, hiding them across ranches when it suits them. Each cache is a lifeline. Without it, their operation starves. He cut a small swatch of burlap, tucking it into his notebook. Evidence mattered more than rumor. Back inside, Clara poured coffee, her hands steady despite the gravity of her tale. Pinkerton studied her across the table. There was resilience in her posture, the quiet courage of one who had already lost much. Why help me, Mrs. Dawson? Speaking against outlaws makes enemy. Her gaze flicked toward the portrait of her husband. Elias fought in the war. He said once that men who use fear to rule are worse than any enemy with a rifle. This writer, whoever he is, has half the town afraid to breathe. If I can help unmask him, then maybe I keep another widow from staring at an empty chair. Pinkerton inclined his head respectfully. Then your testimony will not be wasted. Before leaving, he walked the perimeter of her land. His eyes searched for impressions too faint for the casual glance, a broken spur half buried in the dirt near the fence line, its rowel missing. He brushed it clean, turning it in his hand. Stamped faintly on the shank were letters, U.S. 7th Cav. The same regiment now whispered in shame after the Sioux campaigns. He noted it carefully, cavalry spur, damaged. Confirms deserter suspicion. As the prairie wind picked up, he studied the horizon. Somewhere out there, perhaps not 20 miles distant, a band of trained men moved in secrecy, guided by a masked leader who had turned discipline into dread. But men left trails no matter how well concealed. He would find them. By late afternoon, Pinkerton returned to Dodge. He stabled his horse and climbed the stairs to his hotel room. The desk lamp sputtered to life as he opened his notebook to compile the day's findings. Clara Dawson confirms riders crossing ranchland. Signal lanterns exchanged with distant ridge. One rider visibly limps. Army oats hidden in her barn, government property. Cavalry spur recovered with 7th Cav stamp. He underlined the last point twice. The 7th Cavalry. Desertion, disgrace, men with reason to despise both government and law. And perhaps their leader, an officer with knowledge of military codes, had fashioned himself a mask of terror. Pinkerton's pen paused. He considered Marshall Tate. The limp. The secrecy. Was it coincidence, or something darker? His instincts urged caution. Too soon to accuse. Better to collect the web fully before tugging at its strands. He closed the notebook, extinguished the lamp, and sat in the dimness for a moment. Outside, Dodge City roared with music and laughter, but in the quiet room Allan Pinkerton weighed truth against myth, soldier against outlaw, fear against reason. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ride not with witnesses but with bait. To truly test the masked rider's hand, he would have to risk the ambush himself. For now, the widow's testimony was inked into the growing case file. Her courage had brought him closer. And closer, on the frontier, meant more dangerous than ever. Chapter 5, Ambush at the Crossing. The dawn was sharp as flint when Allan Pinkerton left the Dodge House Hotel. A thin frost glazed the hitching posts, and the town streets were still quiet, save for the echo of a lone blacksmith's hammer. Pinkerton moved with measured purpose, the brim of his hat pulled low, his revolver checked and rechecked beneath his coat. This day would not be spent chasing whispers, this day he intended to meet the masked rider face to face. Marshal Tate was waiting by the stables, a dour figure with his limp more pronounced in the morning chill. "You're certain about this?" he asked. "As certain as one must be when baiting wolves," Pinkerton replied dryly. "The stage leaves at noon, carrying a shipment worth any outlaw's trouble. If the rider strikes, he will strike then." Tate's jaw worked. "And if he does, you'll be in the coach." "Exactly where I should be." By midday, the stagecoach stood ready outside the depot, its wheels newly greased, its harness polished, the driver a young man with nerve showing in his pale face. Beside Pinkerton sat two deputies, shotguns resting across their knees. Yet only Pinkerton knew the true weight of the ruse. The strongbox inside held no gold, only iron scrap wrapped in burlap. The bait was deception, as much as the rider's mask was. The passengers were a nervous assortment, a peddler with sample cases, a ranch wife traveling to visit kin, and Pinkerton himself, disguised in plain workman's clothes. He kept his notebook tucked away, his eyes scanning every ridge and draw as the stage rolled out of Dodge and onto the open trail. The prairie unfolded vast and brittle under a sky the color of steel. Hours passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the creak of harness and the driver's occasional shout to his team. The land around them grew rougher, gullies and rock outcrops forming natural ambush points. Pinkerton marked each with a soldier's eye, counting ridges, gauging distances. He had not fought in the war, but he had hunted men who had, and he knew their habits. It was near sunset when the first sign appeared. On a distant bluff to the south, a flash of light glimmered once, twice, 3 times. To most eyes it could have been the sun catching a bottle shard. To Pinkerton, it was the call of conspirators. His hand drifted casually to his revolver. The attack came swift as thunder. From the ravine erupted 4 riders, masks drawn, rifles already spitting fire. The driver cried out, horses screamed, and the coach lurched violently. One bullet shattered the peddler's case, another tore a hole through the canvas roof. Passengers ducked and screamed. Pinkerton did not flinch. His eyes sought not the chaos, but the order within it. He saw the limping rider again, lagging half a stride but firing steadily. He saw 2 flankers splitting wide, boxing the stage. And behind them, commanding the charge, the masked rider himself. The polished metal faceplate gleamed like molten silver in the fading light, empty eyeholes staring cold. He raised his hand, and the others obeyed like soldiers to a drill sergeant. Pinkerton drew and fired. His bullet clipped the limping rider's shoulder, sending him swaying in the saddle. Another round struck sparks from a rock as a second outlaw ducked low. Bullets shredded the coach's panels, and the driver slumped forward, hat flying as blood streaked his sleeve. The deputies answered with their shotguns, thunder echoing off the ravine walls. One bandit's horse screamed and stumbled, throwing its rider into the dust. But the rest pressed on, the masked rider circling like a hawk, silent, merciless. The coach careened wildly as the frightened team bolted. Pinkerton braced himself, firing again. He aimed not for the mask but the horse's reins in the rider's hand. His bullets snapped leather, and the outlaw fought to regain control. For the first time, the masked rider faltered, wheeling away into the gully with a harsh jerk of his mount. The ambush collapsed into retreat. The limping rider, blood darkening his coat, signaled frantically, and the bandits wheeled their horses, vanishing into the maze of gullies with astonishing speed. Within minutes, silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded driver and the labored breathing of the horses. The deputies reloaded shakily, eyes wide. "We drove 'em off," one muttered. Pinkerton shook his head. "No. They chose to leave. They know the gullies, we do not." This was but a test. Climbing down from the coach, he searched the ground swiftly before the dust settled. There, a kerchief soaked in blood, dropped by the limping rider. Pinkerton lifted it carefully. Stitched into the corner were initials, H.T. He folded it, tucking it into his notebook. Nearby, hoofprints marked the earth. Not random, but in disciplined formation, 2 flanking, 1 rear, 1 forward. It was the movement of cavalry patrols, ingrained by endless drills. No gang of drunks or drifters could ride with such precision. Pinkerton crouched where the masked rider had wheeled away. In the dirt lay the faint imprint of a spur, jagged where a rowel once broke. The same pattern he had found at Clara Dawson's ranch. The web was tightening. Night fell as they limped the damaged stage back toward Dodge. The ranch wife sobbed quietly, the peddler clutched his broken wares, and the deputies muttered prayers. Pinkerton remained silent, his eyes distant. He had seen the enemy now, not in rumor but in flesh, a commander who wielded silence and fear as weapons, his men drilled like soldiers, his mask a gleaming terror in the dusk. Back in his hotel room, Pinkerton lit the lamp and spread the evidence across the desk, the bloodied kerchief, the cavalry spur fragment, the army oat sack swatch. Each piece aligned with ruthless clarity. These were not phantoms. These were men bound by a military past, deserters perhaps, led by one who understood that fear was stronger than any rifle. He wrote in his notebook with deliberate hand. Engaged ambush. Formation confirms military training. Masked leader silent, commanding with gestures. Limping rider wounded, initials HT on kerchief. Outlaws retreated by design, not defeat. Next step, trace identity of deserters from 7th Cavalry. Suspect connection within Dodge itself, lantern signals too precise to be random. When the ink dried, he closed the book. Beyond the thin walls of the hotel, the saloons roared again, laughter spilling into the streets. But in Pinkerton's mind the sound of hooves still thundered, and the gleam of the rider's mask still burned. The next move, he knew, must be his. Chapter 6, The Deserted Fort. The prairie dawn rose bleak and colorless, as if the sun itself hesitated to look upon the violence of the previous day. Allan Pinkerton rode out alone, his horse's hooves striking sparks on frozen earth. The failed ambush still echoed in his mind, the gleam of the mask, the military precision of the riders, the wounded outlaw who had vanished into the gullies. But evidence had been left behind, and evidence was a trail, however faint. He carried the bloodied kerchief marked with initials, the broken spur stamped 7th Cav, and the burlap swatch from Clara Dawson's barn. Together, they painted a picture that pointed west, toward the Cimarron River country, where stories whispered of an abandoned army post left to rot after the war. Pinkerton trusted whispers less than tracks, but this time both converged. By midday, the land grew harsher. The rolling plains gave way to scrub and rock, gullies twisting like scars across the earth. Coyotes skulked in the distance, their cries thin against the wind. At last, half buried in shadow, he saw it, a low rise crowned with the skeletal remains of palisade walls, timbers blackened by age. The flagpole stood bare, leaning as though weary. This was the fort, once a symbol of discipline, now a husk. Pinkerton dismounted at the edge of the ruins, tethering his horse in a patch of scrub. He moved carefully, revolver drawn, eyes sweeping the ground. At first glance the place seemed deserted, but closer inspection revealed the lie. Ashes still glowed faintly in a fire pit near the gate. Boot prints marred the dust. A half-eaten loaf of bread lay discarded, its crust no more than a day old. Inside the barracks, sunlight slanted through broken shutters, illuminating crude cots fashioned from army planks. On one, he found a blood-stained bandage, freshly tied. The limping rider had been here. Pinkerton examined the knot, tight, efficient, the work of a practiced hand. Whoever patched him up knew soldiering. He pressed deeper. In what had once been the quartermaster's room, maps were tacked to the wall with knives. Stage routes traced in charcoal, supply depots circled, ranches marked with XS. The handwriting was precise, almost military. Beneath the maps, crates lay stacked, army crates, their stenciled lettering faded but unmistakable, property, U.S. Army. Inside were lanterns identical to those described by witnesses, their glass polished, wicks trimmed. Pinkerton felt a grim satisfaction. This was no phantom's lair. This was a command post. He took out his notebook and recorded each discovery with meticulous care. Fort inhabited. Maps detail stage routes. Lanterns used for signaling. Army crates confirm deserter stockpile. In a corner, he found something stranger still, a mask, half-finished, hammered from a breastplate, edges jagged. The gleam of it in the dim light was uncanny, and he understood at once how fear-struck passengers had mistaken man for ghost. Holding it in his hands, he felt the weight of superstition made flesh. He set it down with care, unwilling to grant it more reverence than it deserved. A sudden creak outside snapped his head around. Footsteps. Pinkerton moved silently to the shattered doorway, revolver raised. Two men entered the courtyard carrying saddlebags. Their clothes were rough, but their posture screamed soldier. One limped heavily, the wounded rider. The other kept a rifle at ease, his eyes scanning without true vigilance. Pinkerton considered the odds. Two now, more perhaps returning soon. He slipped back into the barracks shadows, retreating to the far side where broken shutters opened to the bluff. He could not yet confront them, not without reinforcements. But he could observe. Through a crack, he watched the limping man sink onto a crate, clutching his side. The other bandit opened a lantern and flashed 3 quick signals toward the ridge. Moments later, faint but visible, a reply flickered from miles away. Pinkerton's deduction hardened into certainty. They were not random marauders but a disciplined unit, moving with coded precision. As darkness neared, he withdrew quietly, circling back to his horse. The fort was proof, but proof meant little without capture. He would need to bring Dodge the truth in undeniable form. Yet one thought gnawed at him as he rode back under a bruised sky: Marshal Tate. The limp, the authority, the access. Clara's words returned to him, a man who rode like an officer. Was the lawman himself the shadow at the center of this web? Back in town, Pinkerton presented his findings to a trusted deputy rather than the marshal. The deputy's eyes widened at the mention of the fort. That place? No one's been there in years. No one you admit to, Pinkerton replied grimly. But I've seen maps, lanterns, fresh bandages. Your masked rider makes his lair there, with men who once drilled under army banners. He gave strict instructions: send word by telegraph to Kansas City. I want names of every officer discharged from the 7th Cavalry in disgrace. And quietly. No whisper to Marshal Tate. That night, he sat alone in his hotel room, the evidence spread once more before him. The kerchief, the spur, the oats, the mask. Each a thread, together a rope strong enough to hang a man. He wrote in his notebook. Deserter gang confirmed. Base established in abandoned fort near Cimarron. Mask a device of terror, not superstition. Lantern signaling proves military code. Suspect leadership by former officer. Marshal Tate's limp matches wounded rider, correlation too sharp to ignore. Next step, confrontation with evidence prepared, snare set at fort. The lamp flickered low, shadows stretching across the walls. Outside, the town raged with its usual revelry, but in Pinkerton's mind the battlefield had shifted. He had seen the heart of the riders' operations, smelt their smoke, touched their tools. The ghost of the plains was no more than a man hiding behind stolen discipline. And Allan Pinkerton, who had made a life of tearing masks from liars and killers, was prepared to do so again. Chapter 7, The Colonel of Shadows. The storm rolled in from the west like an army on the march, clouds thick and bruised, thunder growling low across the prairie. Allan Pinkerton felt the weight of it pressing as he rode into Dodge that evening, coat flaring behind him in the wind. He had returned from the deserted fort with proof enough to hang 10 men. Yet evidence was only half the battle. The other half was bringing the truth into the light, and surviving the attempt. Marshal Tate met him outside the jailhouse, a lantern swinging from his hand. His limp was heavier now, though he masked it with the swagger of authority. "You've been ridin' out alone again," Tate said with forced casualness. "Dangerous thing, Mr. Pinkerton. These plains don't forgive wanderers." Pinkerton's eyes, cold and sharp, studied him in silence before replying. "Nor do they forgive traitors." Tate's mustache twitched, but his voice stayed smooth. "You're treadin' near slander, detective." "Am I?" Pinkerton countered softly. He leaned closer, voice pitched so only Tate could hear. "I found the fort. I found your maps, your crates, your masks hammered from breastplates. And I found a bloodied bandage tied by a hand that knows discipline. The masked rider is not a spirit, Marshal. He is an officer. An officer who limps." For the first time, the Marshal's eyes flickered. He turned away quickly, barking orders to a deputy, but the mask of calm had cracked. Pinkerton had seen it. That night, Pinkerton set his snare. He convened with Clara Dawson and 2 deputies he trusted. Together they devised a simple, deadly plan: stage another gold shipment, spread word through channels the outlaw's ears could not resist, and force the rider into open pursuit. The strongbox would be bait, but the true prize would be the capture of the man who led them. Before dawn, telegraphs had already gone east, carrying Pinkerton's coded request for reinforcements. But time was short. The storm building overhead would not wait for bureaucracy. By dusk, the stage rolled out once more, this time loaded with hidden rifles and decoy treasure. Pinkerton rode alongside on horseback, hat low, rain already needling his shoulders. The prairie ahead darkened under boiling clouds, gullies yawning like mouths eager to swallow them. He felt the tension in the air sharpen, not just from the storm, but from expectation. The outlaws would come. And they did. Lantern flashes cracked across the ridge, 3 pulses, then 2. Like a signal gun before battle. From the shadows emerged the riders, cloaks whipping, guns already in hand. At their head, gleaming through sheets of rain, came the masked rider, his metal face a ghastly reflection of lightning. The ambush crashed down in thunder and gunfire. Pinkerton spurred his horse forward, revolver barking. Deputies fired from the coach windows, bullets striking sparks from stone. The bandits rode in formation, precise even in chaos, cutting through the storm with discipline. Pinkerton's shot clipped a rider's hat clean off, another grazed a horse's flank, sending it screaming sideways. But it was the leader he sought. Always the leader. The rider raised his hand, and the bandits obeyed, circling the coach with military precision. But when lightning split the sky, Pinkerton caught the truth, the way the rider sat tall despite the storm, the iron-straight spine, the authority radiating even through silence. He knew then, beyond doubt. Marshal Tate. Pinkerton wheeled his horse hard, cutting across the rider's path. Their eyes met, one hidden behind a mask of gleaming steel, the other cold and unflinching. The rider drew a saber, cavalry issue, its blade flashing white in the stormlight. Pinkerton raised his revolver, but Tate struck, steel hissing past his shoulder. They clashed at full gallop, thunder overhead, hooves pounding beneath. Tate swung again, forcing Pinkerton low in the saddle. The detective fired, shattering the mask's edge, revealing a sliver of familiar flesh beneath. Tate cursed, voice carrying over the storm, breaking his silence for the first time. "You should have stayed east, Pinkerton." The fight spiraled down the slope toward the river crossing. Deputies and outlaws tangled behind, but Pinkerton pursued only Tate, their duel carving through mud and lightning. At the riverbank, Tate wheeled suddenly, charging headlong with saber raised. Pinkerton steadied his revolver, waited until the last instant, and fired. The bullet struck true, not the heart, but the shoulder. Tate's saber fell into the river with a splash, and his horse reared, throwing him violently into the mud. The mask tore away, clattering across the rocks. And there, gasping in the rain, lay Marshal Tate, his limp leg twisted beneath him, his face pale with fury. The deputies reached them moments later, weapons drawn. The outlaws, seeing their commander fallen, scattered into the storm, vanishing into gullies they knew better than any lawman. But without their leader, their discipline dissolved into chaos. Pinkerton dismounted, revolver still steady. He looked down at Tate, who clutched his bleeding shoulder, mud streaking his uniform coat. "You used the people's fear," Pinkerton said, voice as hard as the rain. "You dressed yourself in legend, turned discipline into terror. But you forgot one thing, Marshal. Fear cannot withstand the truth." Tate sneered, spitting blood. "Truth won't save you out here. The plains don't care for law or justice. They care for strength. Then strength will carry you only as far as the gallows," Pinkerton replied. The deputies hauled Tate to his feet, shackling him with Pinkerton's iron cuffs. The once respected marshal of Dodge City, the so-called masked rider, now stood exposed not as phantom or avenger, but as a man broken by greed and pride. The storm lashed around them, but to Pinkerton it felt like a cleansing, lightning striking away illusion, thunder drowning superstition. By the time they dragged Tate back toward Dodge, the storm had begun to ease. The outlaws were scattered, their mask of discipline torn away with their leader's fall. The prairie smelled of rain and gunpowder, heavy and raw. Pinkerton rode behind the stage, his notebook safe once more in his pocket, but the image of Tate's mask lingered in his mind, a reminder of how thin the veil between order and chaos could be when men chose fear over truth. Chapter 8, Justice on the Plains. Dawn spilled pale light across Dodge City, rinsing the muddy streets in silver after the storm. The saloons were hushed, their doors still closed, the chaos of the night replaced by uneasy silence. On the jailhouse steps, townsfolk gathered in wary clusters, craning their necks toward the barred window. Inside sat the man they once trusted, Marshal Tate, shackled, his proud frame slumped in defeat. The news had spread faster than any stagecoach. The masked rider, scourge of the plains, was no phantom at all, but their own lawman. Mothers clutched children closer, ranchers muttered bitter curses, gamblers spat into the dust. Some refused to believe it, clinging stubbornly to the tale of a ghostly outlaw rather than accept betrayal by a man sworn to uphold the badge. Pinkerton stepped from the hotel, his long coat brushing the boardwalk, eyes sharp but expression unreadable. He carried his black notebook in one hand, revolver holstered, the weariness of weeks etched into his posture. Yet there was no triumph in his step, only purpose. Cases did not end with capture, they ended with truth made undeniable. Inside the jailhouse, Tate sat on a cot, shoulder bandaged roughly, his limp more obvious than ever. He looked up as Pinkerton entered, a sneer ghosting his lips. "You'll get your glory now, detective." Pinkerton, the great man who unmasked the rider. "They'll tell stories about you." Pinkerton's voice was cool as steel. "Stories are not my trade, Marshal. Facts are." He opened the notebook, its pages filled with precise handwriting. "Here are yours, stage routes marked in your hand, army crates in your possession, signals exchanged with deserters. And this," he set the broken spur on the table, "dropped by your own boot. You wore 2 masks, Tate, one of polished steel, and one of borrowed law. Both are broken." Tate's sneer faltered, replaced by something harder, shame, perhaps, or the echo of once-held honor. He looked away, muttering, "Men forget what the frontier takes. I gave this town order when no one else could. They'll thank me in the end." "No," Pinkerton said flatly. "They'll bury the fear you spread. And they'll remember justice, not you." By noon, the courtroom was packed. A makeshift trial convened in the town hall, the judge grim and resolute. Evidence was laid out upon a long table, the lanterns seized from the fort, the bloodied kerchief, the oaths stamped with army property, the shattered mask. Witnesses testified, Clara Dawson describing the riders crossing her ranch, the schoolteacher recalling the officer's bearing, the deputies recounting the ambush at the crossing. Each word tightened the noose of truth. Pinkerton testified last. He spoke calmly, without flourish, detailing each discovery in sequence, letting the evidence speak louder than any rhetoric. He described the tracks swept with brush, the military formation of the outlaws, the lantern signals flashing across ridges. When he finished, the room was silent save for the scrape of the judge's gavel. The verdict came swift, guilty of murder, robbery, and betrayal of oath. Marshal Tate would hang. That night, the town exhaled. The saloons reopened, the piano struck its jaunty chords again, but the laughter carried a brittle edge. Fear lingered still, the kind that took time to fade. Yet relief mingled with it. The ghost who had haunted the stage trails was gone. Gold shipments could resume, ranchers could ride without watching shadows, and mothers could tell their children that phantoms bled when unmasked. Clara Dawson found Pinkerton outside the Golden Spur, where lamplight flickered across his weary face. "You've given this town back its nights," she said softly. Pinkerton tipped his hat. "You gave me the first truth, Mrs. Dawson. Without it, the rider would still roam." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. "What'll you do now?" He glanced toward the rail yard, where smoke already curled from the eastbound train. "There will be another case. There always is." Back in his room, Pinkerton sat at the desk one last time, notebook open beneath the lamp. He wrote with deliberate strokes, committing the case to record. Case closed. Masked Rider unmasked as Marshal Tate of Dodge City. Used fear and superstition to command deserter gang. Discipline weaponized, truth concealed by legend. Justice restored through exposure of fact. Lesson: fear is the outlaw's greatest ally. Yet fear crumbles before truth. He paused, then added one final line: the frontier breeds phantoms, but phantoms are nothing more than men who believe themselves untouchable. They all leave a trace. And I will find it. Closing the notebook, he slipped it into his coat. The whistle of the midnight train echoed through the town, long and mournful. Pinkerton rose, adjusted his hat, and walked into the night. At dawn, the gallows were built. The townsfolk gathered in solemn silence as Tate was led forth, no longer marshal, no longer rider, merely a man broken by greed. He mounted the steps with the limp that had betrayed him, eyes scanning the crowd without remorse. The rope tightened, the trap dropped, and with it ended the legend of the masked rider. Pinkerton stood apart from the crowd, his expression unreadable. Justice was never a victory parade, it was a duty, grim and necessary. He watched only long enough to be sure the case was truly closed, then turned toward the station. The plains stretched wide beyond Dodge, sun burning away the last of the storm clouds. Somewhere out there, another telegram would soon come, another crime, another phantom cloaked in lies. But for now, the prairie was quiet. Allan Pinkerton mounted the eastbound train, the notebook heavy in his pocket, and let the whistle carry him into the horizon. The ghost had been unmasked, the town freed, and the detective's work, as always, continued.